the front page of the Financial Times, which contains the words Brexit, Brussels and fishing. I'll say that again because you may be forgiven for thinking that it's 2015 or 2016, but goodness me. Brexit, Brussels and fishing on the front page of what is, on some mornings, the only newspaper that comes close to reflecting reality. We are a bonkers country. I don't know whether you've noticed, and I say that affectionately as part of the bonkersness. But all of the conversation about economy and growth today, which I think is probably going to get burst by Donald Trump's tariffs and possibly the impact of the national insurance stuff as well. But it's good news. Everyone's excited about it. Keir Starmer doing a lap of honour. Nobody ever mentions the billions, the untold sums of money that we have sacrificed by becoming the first population in history to impose economic sanctions on ourselves. Do you want to know a secret? Even I get bored of pointing it out. It feels so utterly pointless. Imagine if the boy who cried wolf was ignored even as the wolves were eating all the sheep. He's standing there going, wolf, wolf, wolf. And the villagers are going, oh, shut up, will you? Honestly, no one believes you. Or no one cares about all the... Listen, we were pro-sheep being eaten. We may not have said so at the time, but that's like sovereignty. We like to see our sheep being eaten. So even I get a bit bored sometimes of going, it's absolutely insane how all conversations about the UK economy ignore the single biggest influencing factor on all negativity. Not the only one, but the single biggest explanation of why things are considerably worse than they could be gets completely ignored. I like the word bonkers. I don't know whether a couple of people will add it to the list of things that they don't like you saying, but I like the word bonkers because it has a sort of agreeable bounciness to it. It's absolutely bonkers. And it turns out we've been in a sausage war, which again is evidence of how, as a country, we went from talking about almost nothing else to talking about it not at all in the space of about 6 months. And you know why, don't you? The speed with which it became clear that Brexit was the stupidest thing the country has ever done to itself was such that all of the people that told you it was a brilliant idea had two choices. They could either come clean, say sorry, and beg for your forgiveness, or they could shut up completely and barely mention it. In fact, I guess the most disingenuous and ill-informed would probably have explicitly called for you to stop talking about it and claimed that nobody wanted to talk about it anymore, an expression of such epic ignorance that you wonder whether these people should be left in charge of a stapler. So that's why we went almost overnight. Even What's-His-Chops never talks about it anymore. Farage. The only context in which Farage will talk about Brexit is if they do something to undo the damage, and he'll start bleating about betrayal. He was supposed to leave the country if it failed. I hope nobody held their breath for that to happen. So it's so weird. It's so bonkers. There's so much strange stuff going on, isn't there, about the national interest, that some mornings you sort of sit here and feel it's beyond discombobulated. It is as if we occupy two realities. One that exists and one that remains the sort of hangover or the aftermath of the suspension of reality that had to occur in 2016 to get the referendum over the line. I mean, immigration we talked about a lot this week because of Keir Starmer's hideous language. And, of course, that has done the precise opposite of what Brexit said it was going to do. And for the tiny, tiny, vanishingly small number of people who voted for Brexit because they're racist, hashtag sarcasm alert, it's done the polar opposite of what they wanted, because the areas in which immigration has rocketed is from parts of the world where people look even less, quotes, indigenous, end quotes, than our fellow Northern Europeans did, or even Southern Europeans. I mean, every single thing about it is bonkers. And I don't know whether Keir Starmer could have walked into Downing Street and started trying to undo the bonkersness, but he could have tried. And yet here we are. He's almost done the opposite. He's almost done the opposite. And that leads us to today, when the words Brexit, Brussels and fishing are on the front page of the Financial Times, and the words sausage war are on page 2 of the Telegraph, both fronting up similar stories. Did you know that sausages have become totemic in Brexit? I didn't even know that. I thought I was an expert on this stuff. They call me James O''Brexit. I had no idea that sausages had become totemic. So there are two angles on the same issues. The FT reports that preparations for a post-Brexit reset of relations between the UK and the EU have been thrown into turmoil over demands from the EU, demands from Brussels regarding fishing rights and youth mobility. The Telegraph has a rather more upbeat analysis, and it suggests that the sausage war will end in return for some fishing rights. So the EU will lift its ban on UK exports of fresh sausages, mince and other chilled meats, which you probably didn't know had been in place since the beginning of January 2021. Actually, didn't Boris Johnson once insist that could never possibly happen? I've just got a memory of him waving something in the air. Here's an image you never want to have brought to your attention. I've just got an image of Boris Johnson waving a sausage in the air. Maybe it wasn't a sausage, perhaps it was a kipper. Anyway, I don't remember. The point is this. There has been a ban in place on British meat since January 2021, and they are prepared to lift it in return for more long-term access to fishing waters. Red tape, border checks and onerous health certificates introduced as a consequence of people voting to reduce red tape, border checks and onerous health certifications would be lifted. You'd also see food products, other food products having all of the red tape dramatically reduced in a new veterinary deal. It means, are you bored yet? Are you bored yet? It's a weird one, right? It used to be the most interesting story in town. I'm beginning to think it had absolutely nothing to do with imports or exports, red tape, fishing, meat, or any of the above, and all to do with something else. Because one of the things that they're demanding is a 4-year deal on fishing rights to replace the agreement that was struck in Brexit trade negotiations. Right, that's the dry bit over. Here's the weird bit. Ready? There's 2 questions I'm going to ask, one of which you need to have quite a lot of qualifications to answer. By qualifications, I simply mean knowledge and experience, 2 things that have always been sadly lacking from almost all conversations with the word Brexit in the title. But what has happened to our fishing industry since the Brexit that was supposed to deliver it so much actually happened? I mean, if you stop for a minute and think about how prominent fishing was. There was that poor woman in Lowestoft who used to ring us all the time. Do you remember? If you stop for a moment and reflect upon how prominent fishing wasn't Farage on one of the key committees in Brussels? He never turned up, needless to say, but he obviously understood the salience of it as a rabble-rousing tactic. Although I think the speed with which the entire fishing industry got thrown under a boat speaks of what other areas of the country may experience if they continue to back that particular horse. But the prominence of fishing was absolutely extraordinary. It was probably the thing you'd think of first if you set aside immigration and asked yourself why it was important that we leave the European Union. Do you remember? I'm not misremembering, am I? If you managed to set aside immigration, which is obviously impossible to do, but if you tried and you said, why do we have to get out of the European Union? And people would say fishing. They're stealing our fish. I think you can see where the second question is going to go. But the first one, very simply, is what has happened? 0345 6060 973. What has happened to fishing since Boris Johnson told you that we had to leave the European Union to boost British fishing, since Nigel Farage told you that we had to leave, that leaving the European Union would deliver untold glories and riches to the UK fishing industry? Do we know what the impact has actually been on the UK fishing industry? Because it was supposed to be a game changer. That's one of the most boring questions I've ever asked you, isn't it? But I am quite intrigued to hear what your answer to it is. I think the answers will be a lot more interesting than the question. What actually happened to the fishing industry of the United Kingdom, when we did the thing that we were told would really help them? All right, hit the numbers now. You will get through. 0345 6060 973. And then this is a really personal enthusiasm. And this is A question I want you to take a moment to think about and then call me. Because I can't think of anything else. You possibly can. Didn't Rees-Mogg start talking about British fish being happy? I mean, I use that word bonkers with some justification. I'm not sure things were ever more bonkers than in regard to fishing. I truly think that when people like Jacob Rees-Mogg started talking about fish being happier because they were in British waters, you realise that as a country we had taken collective leave of our senses. And there will be some obvious answers to this second question, but that's why I want you to think about it. I don't mind if the answers are obvious. I want to get as many as I can on the table. Why? Why did it assume this epic importance and then disappear almost overnight? Why was it such an effective weapon for people who have turned out to be either liars or idiots? Or that's not fair. Liars or idiots or both. Why was the fishing industry such an effective tool for all those tools? 0345 6060973. Have a think, seriously. I mean, you can be fairly confident that none of them are happy with how things have turned out. We don't fully understand what has gone wrong or why. So that is question number one, 0345 6060973. But we may live in a bonkers country. It may continue to be bonkers. There's something else going on today that I think will help you understand why Keir Starmer adopts the approach to matters EU that he adopts, and I don't like the approach, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try to understand it. Why did an issue that felt like the most important issue in the piece disappear almost entirely? And of course, to answer that question, we need to understand why it was such an incredibly effective lever, why it was such an effective wedge. And that I really want to stress the two facets, the two sides of this question, because the more important we remember it was, the madder it seems that it disappeared almost immediately. You couldn't move in some fishing towns for camera crews. You couldn't, literally, you could barely moor a boat at a quay because the BBC had beaten you to it. Sky News would be over there and ITV would be there. You'd have newspaper journalists and radio journalists sticking their microphones in the mouths of every fisherman they could find. They'd be in the pubs going, "Excuse me, sir, have you ever been fishing? Could I ask you about Brexit?" Brexit and fishing went together like a horse and carriage, like Morecambe and Wise. And then suddenly it seems, doesn't it? I've never clocked this before until I saw the front page of the Financial Times today, which contained the words Brussels, Brexit and fishing. And I had this sort of weird flashback to when you could barely open a newspaper without seeing the words Brussels, Brexit and fishing in front of you. So how did it go from being one of the biggest stories in town to being absolutely ignored? 0345 6060973. And of course, contingent upon that is the question of why it was such an effective weapon for the various weapons that told you Brexit would be brilliant for fishing. I don't even know if we can ask why we all fell for it. Did you fall for it? It's so strange, right?